Hello, I'm Maximus Rex. I'm a longtime MMO player and have played SWTOR as an immortal juggernaut since pre-launch. Today I want to talk about the changes BioWare have announced to patch 5.9 that have been offered as a way to address Skank Tanks, which has been a long-standing issue for PvP and more recently has become prevalent in PvE also. A little background for those who might not be as familiar with the topic. A Skank Tank is a defensively spec tank character that forgoes some or all of their defensively static gear in favor of DPS static gear, primarily to increase their damage output in PvP, but as stated before, it is also happening to some extent in PvE content. The reason a tank uses DPS gear over defensive gear is simply that defensive gear has limited effectiveness. In PvP, some defensive stats simply do nothing, and others are less effective than in PvE. And in PvE, these defensive stats have diminishing returns on their effectiveness, so that once you get a certain stat to a certain rating, there is very little benefit to it compared to trying to enhance stats that improve DPS. This situation has been made worse by the extraordinary number of tiers of gear we have had introduced since the last level cap increase, because better gear has more stats. When engaged in PvP, keeping your teammates alive while killing your opponents is a very important part of the gameplay, and often it's the only way to create opportunities to turn the tide of battle in your favor. Since defensive gear stats are doing hardly anything when it comes to keeping the tank or their allies alive, it is then becoming a hindrance when it comes to killing your opponents. This makes wearing DPS gear the right choice in that situation. In PvE team content, especially Ops, the DPS team has to output a certain amount of damage in order to beat an encounter. It is also vital in most encounters that the tank or tanks stay alive in order to control the NPC opponents and prevent them from killing your healers and DPS. Once a tank's gear peaks in defensive performance, it is no longer doing anything more to help keep the tank alive. This makes swapping out some gear mods for DPS mods, or in some encounters where a full-time second tank isn't required, swapping their entire gear set to a DPS statted set, giving the group a bigger cushion to work with should someone die or have technical issues. Or maybe you really like them, but they aren't the best player ever. So keeping all this in mind, BioWare said some time ago they would look at Skank tanking. At the same time, they said that tanks were also overperforming in damage output as a baseline issue, and that they wanted to use patch 5.9 as an opportunity to address both these issues. On April 5th, 2018, Eric Musco posted on the BioWare forums changes they are implementing to deal with these two issues. While the changes do address baseline damage output for tanks, it does nothing to fix the underlying issues that push a tank player to Skank Tank, which is defensive gear is not useful enough. If anything, the DPS reductions place even more pressure on tanks to forego defensive gear in favor of DPS gear, and as a way to try and offset their reduction in damage input. An effective change to eliminate Skank tanking needs to make defensive gear always better than DPS gear. Maybe they need to do more to reduce the glut of tiers between level cap increases. Maybe tanks need to get their power from their defensive stats instead of, or in addition to, their primary stats. Maybe defensive stats must also increase threat and the effectiveness of taunts and other group defensive moves. I don't know what the best answer is. These are just some ideas, and I'm sure with more scrutiny they have their own flaws as well. The point remains that the underlying issue needs to be fixed to make any long-term fix to Skank Tanks viable. If there are limitations to their system that make it difficult or impossible to properly address these issues, then BioWare needs to come clean and say so. What are your thoughts? I always appreciate mature conversations, so feel free to leave your thoughts below. Thank you for watching, and may the Force ever serve you.